Shalom. And shalom means hello, and it means peace. And I hope that God's peace is keeping your hearts very, very, very hopeful and joyful, and especially at this time of the year, which I'll explain in just a moment. Hi, I'm Rabbi Dr. Joseph Rosenfarb of Beth Messiah Synagogue of Tidewater. Our address here is 7130 Granby Street in Norfolk, Virginia, 23505, 757-423-3440. You can also go to the Beth Messiah website and interact with it. It lists all our events and what's going on at Beth Messiah, some of our history. If you'd like to leave some feedback there, we will get to that feedback either by email or we might even answer those questions in some of these videos in the future. All right, so we welcome your responses. Tonight at Beth Messiah, we are celebrating in the year 2012 the festival of Purim. Purim comes from the word pur. Pur means lot, and Purim means lots. And the meaning is that the lots were drawn and came out against Haman and against the heroes of the story, Mordecai and Esther. And Haman, of course, is from the lineage of Amalek, whose line was to be blotted out because of what they did to Israel in the journey in the wilderness. And so every time that Haman's name is mentioned in the story, there are sounds, boos, and noisemakers and whatnot to blot out his name. And every time the heroes are mentioned, as we read the book of Esther, which is the main backdrop for the festival of Purim, there are cheers and positive responses. It's a joyous holiday. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the book of Esther. The book of Esther is what's called a novella, a short story. It's a genre of scripture that is a highly, highly developed art form. It has an elevated prose and a rhythmic poetry. The word structures are used very, very carefully to tie the story and move the story on. The common person is viewed for these particular stories, just like Jonah or just like the book of Ruth. And these common people just are living their lives normally, never to realize that their lives would impact the whole nation. Here, the whole nation of Israel and the whole empire of Persia. The story is developed during the Persian period with Darius, the king of Persia, an incredibly brilliant and powerful king. And this book itself has a number of motifs that move the story along. I would just like to mention one of those motifs, the motif of banquets. And there are other motifs as well, but the whole concept of banquets moves the story along. I want to give you a taste for the artistry and beauty of this particular book. Let's go through those 10 banquets, shall we? The first banquet occurs in chapter 1 and verse 3, where Darius makes a banquet for all of the nobles and the dignitaries throughout the provinces. The second banquet occurs in chapter 1 and verse 5, specifically for the capital of Susa, both for the small and the great. The third banquet occurs in chapter 1 verse 9, and that's Queen Vashti holding a banquet for the women. And we see the backdrop unfolding. Mordecai and Esther are not mentioned until the second chapter. So the first chapter is really relegated for setting up the backdrop of why Mordecai and Esther fall into such prominence later on. And you know the story. The king falls in love with Esther. He crowns her queen in chapter 2 verse 18. And guess what? There's a banquet that moves the story along again. And then the fifth banquet is the banquet between the king and Haman, as they, after the king signs the edict against the Jewish people to just have them destroyed, because Haman is angry at Mordecai, the Jew, for not bowing down and doing him homage. So he devises this plan, gets the king to consent to destroy the Jewish people. The king sits down to drink with Haman. And then we have banquets 6 and 7. These are Esther's 2 banquets for the king and for Haman in chapter 5 and verse 7. And so the plot unfolds as Esther is going to become now proactive in the salvation of the Jewish people. And then banquet 8 occurs when the Jewish people receive the edict that they can defend themselves against this Haman plot. And there's great rejoicing, and guess what they produce? A banquet, again in chapter 8. And then we've got 2 more banquets in chapter 9, verses 17 and 18. And these banquets are the celebrations of Purim, first throughout the empire, and then specifically in Susa. Did you notice maybe that the first 2 banquets parallel the last 2 banquets? The first 2 banquets, the first one was for all the kingdom. Second banquet was for Susa. The 9th banquet was for all the kingdom, and the 10th banquet was for Susa. It draws the story together in the novella, the short story, a genre of the Bible. Did you notice also that the first 5 feasts were given by the Persians, and the second 5 feasts were given by Jews? And this shows, of course, in a beautiful artistic form, this reversal of fortune, that the downfall of the Jews is turned into the victory for the Jewish people, and that a Persian story develops into a Jewish story. A pagan story develops into a God story. And this is basically the plan of God, to turn the human pagan story into a God story, to turn the pagan feasts of the world into the final banquet of the marriage supper of the Lamb. It is all beautifully pasted together by God throughout the Scripture, and is foreshadowed specifically in the book of Esther. I hope you've enjoyed the symmetry of the book of Esther. As we dig deeper into the book of Esther, you will find more parallels and more motifs that will move the story on. I hope you enjoy the novella in a new way as you celebrate with us the festival of Purim. Shalom.